In the previous episode, we have discussed purification strategies, and to recap the previous conversation, here's a table summarizing our findings. So we have the four heat brackets. We have heat 20, 35, 50, and 70. That's the number of purifications performed, and in the second column, we see the number of polymers that we would expect per heat. If you stop at 20 heat, you could expect to get 42 polymers and spend about 400 plasma cores. And if you go all the way to 35 heat, that would mean a production of 78 polymers on average, and you would have spent around 1,150 plasma cores. Then if you go further down to 50 heat, you would expect to produce around 132 polymers and spend around 2,650 plasma cores. And finally, if you max it all the way to 70, you would expect to see around 206 polymers and spending around 5,650 plasma cores. With that information in mind, I tried creating a little calculator that would compute how long it would take to purify a target number of plasma cores and spit out how much polymers you would expect to get and how much time it would have taken. Here's a table illustrating just that. So in this example, we wanted to purify 10,000 plasma cores. First column is the heat level to stop at. Second column is the weekly average production of polymers. Third column is the plasma consumed weekly if you go all the way to that heat. The rest of the columns are new. So the fourth column, these are the weeks needed. This is self-explanatory. This is the number of weeks it will take to purify that amount of plasma. So if you only do 20 purifications per week, obviously it will take more time to convert them than if you did more purifications every week. So as you can see, at 20 heat, that means it takes 25 weeks to convert all of them into polymers. That goes down to 13.3 weeks if you stop at 35 heat. And that goes even further down to 6.7 weeks if you go to 50. And finally, 3.3 weeks if you do 70, or maximum every week. The fifth column is the total number of polymers produced. There's a little caveat here. I'm using the average number, but in the real world scenario, it might be higher or lower. But I'm sure you already know that. The sixth column is the percent yield, which is basically saying how many percent of the plasma became polymers. The higher the number, it means it is more efficient. The last column is the time taken compared to just doing 20 purifications per week. Obviously, if you do more per week, it will take less time in total at the cost of more plasma. Looking at all of this data, the most interesting part for me is the yield versus week needed. 20 heat produces the most amount of polymers. It has the highest yield, but compared to 35, there's just a little waste there. So from 1050, you go down to 1039, but you cut down the time, but you reduce the time to 53% of how much it would take you if you did 20 per week. Going up to 50 and 70 heat, the yield goes down drastically. So I would say 35 would be the most cost effective, especially since there's a real aspect of time involved. You'd want to do things earlier. 35 is a great compromise. So based on this table, I have decided that 35 heat is the sweet spot if you have the plasma cores to convert. 35 heat is just slightly less efficient than 20 heat, but the time needed is almost half. Now let's flip the table and solve for a target number of polymers. In the previous video, I have determined that it would take 402 polymers to get to Plasma 8 headquarters and Plasma 8 Institute. So I'm using that as my target polymers in the top section of this table. So the first three columns are the same as the previous. You already know this. The fourth column is the number of weeks needed to produce 402 polymers. Obviously, stopping at 20 heat will take the longest at 9.6 weeks, while on the other extreme, stopping at 70 heat would only require 2 weeks. Now the problem between the two is the plasma costs, and you could clearly see the differences between the two. Stopping at 20 heat would only require 3,829 plasma cores, while stopping at 70 heat would require 11,018 plasma cores. That is a difference of over 7,000 plasma cores. And that is a significant amount. Luckily, I personally have a stockpile of 8,000 at around 8,000 plasma cores, which means that if I stopped at 35, I would only need to consume around 5,933 plasma cores, taking 5.2 weeks, and I would still have around 2,000 plasma cores left over for any other construction. I could also be tempted to go all the way up to 50 heat, and that would cut down the time to 3.1, but that would use my entire stockpile. So maybe the sweet spot for me is somewhere between 35 to 50, depending on how much plasma cores I'm willing to waste. If you have a smaller stockpile, I guess you have no choice but to stick to the cheaper options, and that's if you wanted to maintain a healthy supply of plasma cores for your buildings. To make that decision, take a look at the column named Total Plasma Needed. That will be your rough guide to decide whether to burn your entire stockpile or do fewer purifications per week so you could give yourself more time to save. The longer it takes for you to get there, the more time in between for you to accumulate or acquire more plasma cores. That's it for this installment. For the next episode, we will discuss your weekly plasma income. I'll see you then.